Men are not getting laid today. That is not just an economic problem, but it is also a social problem and could cause some issues down the line. Justin, let's describe the issue.
If the mating and dating market is fundamentally broken, you're not going to have the formation of families. And the reason families are so important is because this is the nuclear building block of society. It is not the individual, as perhaps prior generations would lead us to believe, I would argue, but rather it's the generation of a nuclear family, because a nuclear family is probably what creates the best chance of an offspring, or for the offspring, the children, to become productive members of society, so they in turn can have productive members of society, and so on. But Josh, to your prior point, I suspect one of the biggest problems we've got right now is that it's too easy, both for men and for women, to eschew the traditional responsibilities and the traditional sacrifices that people had to make to go into a relationship, to stay in a relationship, and to work on a relationship.
Yeah, that is not just going from the porn epidemic that we are seeing today, the OnlyFans or the Tinder. Today, there is a mass sway to either you can pleasure yourself online or it is very easy to find random hookups. That is no incentive to formulate a long-term family, which is vital to maintaining not only our population, but younger generations to come.
Yeah, and that's just from the male perspective. The females have their own version of this. I mean, I would say what porn is for guys, likes on Instagram or Facebook or whatever are to the ladies. It's that social validation. It's that hit. We're once again back at dopamine, but again, separate video on that topic. The other thing I find really interesting about this entire thing is that if you look at the industry, and now that I've delved into it, Josh, just before we went on stream, we were talking about MindGeek, and you asked me, Justin, what's this company? I'm like, well, have you heard of Pornhub? Have you heard of any of these other properties? This is them. And I find it very interesting that there is I believe it's private out of Quebec or whatever, right, that sits on all this data. Because forget just the content aspect for a second. Imagine if you just sat on all this data and you could data mine all this stuff. That, number one, I'm sure would be very interesting in of itself. But the second thing is who's paying for this? No one, not even God, is in the business of losing money. And yet, to run these servers, to hire the engineers or whatever, this is real money that's being spent, and it's all for free. Josh, that's probably the thing that sends a shiver down my spine, is that how ubiquitous this stuff is to get a hold of.
I would disagree with that, Justin. If you don't know what the product is, you are the product. And if you don't know where you're finding yield, you are the yield. And that is something that is known for the history of time. So all these social media products, everything is free, but that is because you are the actual product, buying products from the websites or billing to their ad revenue. Nothing is free.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. But anyways, not to go down that particular rabbit hole, but I think this is how I would frame the problem, is that if you go back in time to, let's say, the time or whatever, the last fourth turning, whatever, World War II or whatever, right? So 40s and 50s, people had just survived the Depression, had just survived World War II, and society didn't have any time for these frivolities. There's very much this collective cohesion. Listen, we're all in this together. We just accomplished this great task or whatever, right? We can do anything or whatever, right? But then since then, and not to decry this, but I guess this was kind of expected. You had this pivot towards individualism. And so instead of, society, the group being considered, the ultimate good, you now have the individual that's being considered the ultimate good. Pendulum swings one way, pendulum swings the other. And so right now you have the situation where I think people have this entitlement, both men and women, where it's oh, listen, it's always going to be, was it flowers and sunshine and all this other stuff in a relationship? And sure enough, those times will come, but you also have the dark days and the bad days too, and that's just part of life. And when people have this, false expectation, and more importantly, Josh, when people can immediately snap their fingers and jump out of a relationship because, oh, it's just, whatever's not going to work out today, and there's no real consequence for doing that, or even worse, if that one side has to bear a higher degree of consequence than the other. Suddenly you've got a major problem. And so I guess the really big thing is I see it as I just don't see society, or at least that's society in the West, as encouraging the stable formation of the nuclear family. In fact, I see many things that eat away of this. Again, porn being one, the like button being one of them. It's a litany of things. No fault divorce, just pick any one. Pick more.
If you go back and ask your grandparents, my grandmother lives with me, and if I ever asked her, oh, how many boyfriends or how many sexual partners have you had? Back in the day, she would have been known as a whore if she had multiple quote unquote bodies or sexual relationships with different men, just because that was the way the culture was formulated. Now it is not only looked up upon, but it is it's the standard for men and women to have many sexual partners. The problem with this lies that, especially for women, every additional sexual partner that you have wildly decreases your chances of getting married, and that is very bad for formulating families, and that is inevitably the goal of human society. So what is going on when we have a ton of women who cannot find long-term sexual partners, and men who are too beta to stand up to the role as men that are needed? and
Or Josh, if I could just put something, it's not that I would say they can't stand up. It's that it's so easy not to stand up. The alternatives are so seductive, or it's such a good replacement that people like lose their zeal. What was it like? Who was it? I think when Israel took over Palestine or whatever. I haven't verified this myself. Back up. Let me walk that back. I read stories, but I didn't like track this down myself. Where when an occupying country took over the land they were occupying, the first thing they did is they immediately started blasting porn over, just like you turn on your TV or whatever, right? And it's just playing. And the reason is to ameliorate and to calm down and to control and to take the edge off, the problem children, which would be like the young males who would be pissed off, because that's, from the concept of the state wanting to control, that's the number one thing. Josh, I'll tell you one other thing. Before my grandmother passed, I lived with her too until a few years ago. But, before she had the Alzheimer's, she and I would talk, and we were pretty frank, and she was born in 1930. And she made the comment to me, it's like, look, Justin, one of the things I look around nowadays is like circa like 2010 or whatever. Like, look, every time, a woman sleeps with a man, and this is her saying it, she gives a small part of herself to the man. And like she was saying, basically, this is a pretty red pill, but she was basically saying it in from her own standpoint of what was going on. And just to be clear, like, people I think should be free to do whatever they want. But when you promote vice as virtue and virtue as vice, you've got a fundamental problem. Like that's not good. Think of it like this, Josh. If you want to smoke cigarettes, by all means, like smoke cigarettes, but like don't market the stuff to kids. And like if you're going to smoke, at least like put on the side of the packet like, hey, listen, you can do this, but just like know what you're consenting to. And right now, I feel it's kind of the exact opposite. It's like pushing cigarettes on kids and then saying, oh, this stuff is good for you, so smoke up, little Jimmy, or smoke up, little Susie. And like, whoa. Again, I don't want to say people can't smoke, but like we need to accurately describe the consequences and the pitfalls of this so people can make an informed decision. That's my complaint.
And now we have a large portion of young men today that are not only never or not getting laid, but they see zero hope in the future to get laid. That arises with a lot of socio tensions, but also just like buildups of disgustingly wrong habits. Justin was just mentioning, trying to fill in blanks. It's something that really you can't fill the void because you need to have that kind of relationship with that other partner.
It's like junk food for the soul, Josh. It is what it is. Just like junk food's bad for the body. You can have, or maybe soul's not the right way to say it, but like junk food for the libido. Like there's just so many ill effects. And not even that. Like if you look at the studies, like look at the TED Talks. There's one that came up, I can't remember, in the past maybe 3 or 4 years, looking at the dopamine response to especially the male brain and porn. Like it's pretty scary. And again, like this gets back to my prior point. All this stuff is just sitting out there on the internet and it's free. And like who the hell is paying for this stuff? Because I can tell you who's not paying for it, and that's the consumer backup. The consumers are
product, Justin.
Yeah, but still, I mean, like you can't necessarily take that to Chase or what RCV or whatever. Say, oh yeah, these are like no, you got to have money somewhere in this equation. But that's not to take away as from your, I think, your very very accurate point there.
Really change these trends. Would it be people stopping to watch porn, or the mass Tinder wave getting off, OnlyFans stopping to be as popular as it is? I don't see a solution for this. I see the problem getting worse and worse. Do we just need men to grow up and become men again? I don't. Justin, what do you think?
If I was thankfully I'm not, nor am I trying to angle for this position, but I was become like the social czar of like, okay, Justin, fix this problem. You have the authority and the responsibility and the means to do it. What I would do is I would do whatever I could to encourage a stable, like I would start with the concept of how do I encourage a stable family bond? So that means how do you encourage like strong male-female pair bonding? You probably want to take a little bit of look at understanding the epigenetics of the situation. Again, someone else who I can't mention the name of did some really good work into this, but whatever, it is what it is. But I think that would be an interesting place to take a look at. I would also do what I can, and this is where I think society has to come in. Like I would want to bring back a tinge of yesteryear, where you can say like, listen, again, do whatever you want, but like just like we look down on smoking, and like Bloom talks about this too, or whatever, right? With health or whatever, in Closing the American Mind. Like just as we say like, hey, well, listen, smoke if you want, but just understand it's not good for you or whatever, right? I would do the same thing for this. Like, well, if you want to sleep around, as a woman, right, by all means, just do that, but just understand if you do that, there will be a cost to pay over here, because I think what you're going to see happening, and is happening right now, is forget the men for a second. You have a bunch of women who I think have been sold, this, false narrative where they can have it all, only to realize that, the more and more they try to go with these standard accepted norms, the more and more unhappy they become. And rather than like, kind of have the come to Jesus moment and say, wait a minute, the map that I'm trying to, use to navigate to where I want to get to is wrong. They just keep doubling down. When they double down, they get more and more depressed, and, just bad things happen. But the takeaway for these young ladies is that, women time out from reproduction quicker than men do. And so like, that's the thing that I find, that very sad is that like guys, okay, whatever, right? You can father children, and not that you should, but you could, far longer than a woman can bear children. And I worry that there's going to be a lot of women who have lost one of their most valuable assets, at least they're one of the most valuable biological assets, the window of fertility. And yeah, you can do
It's
science.
very lonely for people if they have not had children into their
Yeah.
50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. You don't really think that when you're young, but when you really do just look back and realize that you don't bear children, there's a reason why virtually every single person older people have had kids. It is a fundamental being that humans have always done throughout history, and that is not for no reason. So
Yeah.
we do need men and not just get laid, but maintain families again.
Yeah, I would also do some other things too. Like this would be incredibly controversial, but I would probably institute. I would really crack down on paternity fraud. And boy, we're going to get hate for this, but that's like mandatory, genetic tests, or I wouldn't say mandatory genetic testing, mandatory genetic testing to determine that the father in the birth certificate is actually the father of the child. Like that, I would shut down that, nonsense. Boy, like that. Out of all the controversial things I've said, that's going to be one of the most right there. Oh, like paternity fraud. I would basically do that. I would bring back the concept of at-fault divorce for that to basically see who was wrong. I would, yeah, there's some other things that I would do, but basically what I would do is I would want to disincentivize the economic rationale for one party taking advantage of the other party, forming a relationship, having a child in the relation or children in the relationship, and then splitting the relationship apart to basically for one party to use the kids as economic leverage to continue to extract resources on the pretense of doing it for the kids, over the next 10, 20 years. That's problematic. Anyways, core thing, keep the nuclear family. Whatever I could to strengthen the nuclear family to form, I would go after those policies, and I would go against, or I would if not directly attack, I would do my best to socially shame things that stood in the way of it.